There are some patterns you finish and then almost immediately cast on another. And that's exactly what happened with this one. This is the North Shore Beanie by Ozetta or Hailey Smedley. I have a second one on the needles right now, and I know that that one is not going to be my last. But what surprised me wasn't just how much I liked this hat, it was the knitting experience itself, because this is one of those patterns where the stitches are pretty straightforward, but the construction asks a little more of you in terms of focus. It also asks you or requires you to trust the process. Hi, my name is Taylor, and today I want to recap with you my experience of knitting the North Shore Beanie by Hailey Smedley of Ozetta. This is part of what I'm hoping becomes a regular series here on the channel, where I revisit finished pieces and not necessarily talk about whether the pattern was good or bad, but to talk about what it was actually like to knit. Because when I'm deciding on what to cast on next, that's usually the information I'm most interested in. Not just what the finished object looks like, but what kind of knitting experience am I signing up for? Okay, but before we get into all the details about this hat, I want to tell you a little bit about why this hat is just a little bit more special to me. Even though this is called the North Shore Beanie in terms of the pattern's actual name, I'm starting to lovingly refer to this as my Alaska hat. I finished it while we were traveling around the Kenai Peninsula last week. I started it on the flight up and finished it about a day after we arrived in Alaska. We were staying in a town called Soldotna, which is on the Kenai Peninsula, and we were traveling around the peninsula over the course of an entire week. It afforded me lots of driving time to work on this, and I finished it really quickly, and I got a chance to block it while we were there and actually wear it on several of our travels, and I absolutely love it. One in particular was our trip to Seward. And now when I look at this, and in the future when I look at this or when I wear it, it's a little too hot here to wear this now, but when I go to put it on when the weather starts to cool down, I'll think about Seward. I'll think about morning coffee, walking on the rocky beaches in the area, about going to the aquarium there and walking the streets in this little quaint Alaskan town surrounded by the most gorgeous mountains and Resurrection Bay, and just being in a place that is unlike places I've ever been before. And it was the second time I visited Seward, and it just is so absolutely breathtaking and dreamy. And so this will always remind me of that. And I think it's a fantastic memory. And I feel like the colors really do a good job of kind of emulating where I was. Of course, there's no white here to represent the snowy mountains, but all of these other colors, it just says Alaska to me, and Seward, and spruce trees, and rocky mountainsides, and I think it's just beautiful and gorgeous, and I love it. I love my Alaska hat. Now, this hat calls, oddly enough, and this is something that I mention in my pattern notes over on Ravelry, which that is up and available on Ravelry for those that are interested in hearing or reading my notes about this. But one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting, there are two versions of this pattern. There is a worsted / bulky version and a DK version. I have never, I don't think I've seen a pattern that will call for two different sizes of yarn in the same pattern with the same stitch counts and the same measurements and all of that. This one did. It said you could use a worsted or you could use a bulky. You could use a bulky with a strand of mohair or just worsted. And it's interesting to me because I know that those two yarns on the same needle aren't necessarily always going to give you the same gauge. Whatever, a nitpick, it was interesting. Okay, however, I wanted to try to achieve that heavy worsted Aran / bulky weight yarn with obviously yarn from my stash if I could. And I had my yarn, which is the Fiber for the People Born, Shorn, and Dyed sport weight yarn. This is the yarn in the colorway B-sides. I'll pop up the actual skeins so you can see what they look like as well here. But this is two separate skeins that I held double. So two sport weights held double. Now this yarn, when I dye this yarn and it is finished, it plumps up to I would say heavy sport to DK weight, which is why I thought holding them double would achieve a really good gauge for this particular hat. Well, it did. It absolutely did. Holding it double made for a really great gauge. I'm getting 16 stitches to 4 inches and 28 rows to 4 inches flat in stockinette, which is great, but it also meant that I needed to pick a size smaller than what I typically would knit. So typically I would knit a hat that's a large for the size of my head. But because of the gauge I was getting with this, I take that back. It would be between a medium and a large. It just depends on the measurement. My head is 21.5 inches, and so I always knit whatever corresponds to that, right? But for the sake of this hat and the gauge I was getting here, I needed to size down. So that way I was getting the hat that would fit my head. And that's what I did. I will say, holding these two together, I think it's a great colorway. Heavily variegated, gorgeous. This is a non-superwash yarn. It's very minimally processed. It's a gorgeous natural yarn. So the variegation can become almost watercolory in most places, but it's beautiful. However, you can tell that this skein here is a little less saturated in certain colors than this one. Holding them together makes everything blend evenly and beautifully, and I just love it. Like, look at the way the colors play across the fabric. That whole color pooling thing going on. I mean, you can see where the colors are pooling, but it's very just relatively consistent. And that is because I was holding the two strands together, which is a really great tip, by the way, if you're trying to figure out how to, number one, make your variegated indie dyed yarns go further. You want to avoid any kind of weird color pooling or flashing. Holding the colors together, marling them together, helps to kind of distribute things. And it's, even better if you can pull two of the same colorway and hold them together. Really love this combination. Love the color. I had this was two 350 yard skeins, which is 100 grams, so 200 grams. And this is what I have left over. In fact, I brought my scale so I could tell you exactly what I had left over. Let's change that to grams. This is 53 grams of yarn left over. That's a little over half a skein of yarn after knitting the entire hat. Okay, for this hat, considering, now this is a substantial hat, having 50 grams of yarn left over is pretty good considering. I had to knit the smaller size. Like I said, I sized down to get my size. Because of the gauge I was getting here, I knit the small size, and it turned out to be, it worked out great. I genuinely love wearing this. It fits beautifully. That said, if I were knitting this in the exact same yarn combination again, which I absolutely will someday because I want to knit this hat with the same yarn again. So I will just pair it again. But when I do that, I would size up just simply to gain a little more volume overall. I love this. I think it fits beautifully. I mean, it is, I'm gonna take off my glasses. You're gonna see me. I know that I usually always wear the glasses. It's weird to see people who always wear glasses without them, but it fits beautifully. But I feel up here in the crown, I would like just a little bit more volume. Do you see how this does this weird thing here? It like goes down and it looks like ears. I don't really love that as much. So that tells me that I probably would want a little bit more volume in the crown. But, despite all, I think it's great. And I will knit it again. I'm knitting another one already. I'm just kind of hooked on this hat right now, but I would definitely size up with this particular yarn pairing. And like I said, I am knitting another one. In fact, immediately upon finishing this one, I managed to happen upon some yarn. And we're going to talk about where I purchased this yarn because it took place in Seward, Alaska. I want to share with you the yarn/bookstore I visited in Seward, Alaska. It was awesome. It was just like a Shangri-La experience. It's a highlight of my trip. Stick around to the end of the episode. I'm going to talk more about that. But the yarn that I purchased for this is Kamarosa, or Kamarose, which is a Danish yarn brand. It is Snefnug, which means snowflake, if I'm not mistaken. It is a really gorgeous, floofy, I don't think it's like a blown yarn, but it has a chainette structure. I don't think it's a blown yarn. Maybe it is, but it's absolutely gorgeous. I got it in this colorway here. This is called Vissengrün, and it's this really lovely faded kind of olivey green color. So I picked this up at this yarn store. We're going to talk about it later. And I immediately casted on another one with the needle that I had. Since this hat was off the needle in Alaska, I was able to put this hat on the needles, and I'm working through it, and I absolutely love it. You can see here, I've already worked the brim here. Isn't that gorgeous? And I'm hoping that because I'm using the yarn recommended in the pattern and my gauge is pretty spot on to the gauge that is laid out in the pattern, I'm going to get a little bit more volume. I'm knitting this in the size large. And what's interesting is that I haven't blocked it yet. Obviously the blue one is blocked, there is, so pre-blocked, you can see the overhang over here. I'm hoping that the Camarosa blocks out a little bit and opens up. And I've heard from reading pattern notes that that is exactly what happens with this yarn, that you are surprised by how much it does open up upon blocking. So I'm kind of banking on that. So this is my second version that I've cast it on. And now I am just working the crown, loving every second of it. It's fantastic. It's great. Okay, I want to talk to you about the pattern and give you a little insight into what you're getting into when you break into the North Shore beanie. Okay, while I was adding this project to Ravelry, I noticed something that I've never noticed before. I mentioned that I finished this. I put all my notes in there, marked it as finished, and then it prompted me with something. It said, I can't remember exactly what it is. If I can find the prompt, I'll pop it up for you. But it says, are you finished? Would you like to rate the pattern and the yarn? And so I did. And then when I was done rating those things, it says, what are 3 words you would use to describe this pattern? And I think it did it for the yarn as well. It did it for both. It did it for the pattern and the yarn. 3 words that you would use to describe the pattern for somebody else. And I was pleasantly surprised. I've never noticed that before. If you've noticed that, if they've been doing that on Ravelry for a while, because it only pops up when you finish something, which speaks to how often I finish something. But let me know what the status is on that, because I think it's a really interesting way to get people thinking beyond just, I liked it. And so I chose 3 words for my North Shore beanie. The first was clever, the second was trusting, and the third was rewarding. And now I want to get into why I selected each of those words. We'll start with the first one, which is clever. The construction of this hat really is just that. It's clever. It's the first time I've ever worked a hat like this. And I know it is not the only hat out there like that. And I know that there's probably folks out there that have done so many hats of this similar construction. But for me, it was the first, and I find it to be incredibly clever. One of my favorite things about this is that there isn't a single stitch of ribbing, yet you get this really gorgeous, substantial brim that looks classic while also looking modern, but very staple. I love it. And the fact that there's no ribbing means it kind of starts to fly off the needles pretty quickly. You essentially knit a long stockinette tube for about like 8.5 inches, and then you fold that tube in half. And then you get to a point where you're joining your live stitches with your original cast on row. And that might sound complicated to some. And I think it's just one of those things that's kind of abstract. And as you read it, you think, okay, I can do this. I can actually functionally do the thing that you're saying, but this is very difficult for me to understand what we're doing here. And then once you do it, you're like, oh my gosh, this is, of course, this is fantastic. And I've done this before with collars. My Magnolia Bloom sweater, my Franken sweater, a lot of sweaters I've knit, I've done that same technique where you roll the collar down and then you essentially tack the seams together, which is your live stitches and your cast on row to create a really lovely rolled collar. Well, that same technique is happening here with this hat, and it creates this really beautiful, substantial kind of double layer of fabric. And then later you fold that entire brim over again like this. And so you're wearing essentially 4 layers of stockinette around your brim, and it's incredibly warm and it has really wonderful structure. It creates this like really clean look. You feel like it looks like a very professional hat. I absolutely love it. And I think that that construction is just very clever. It's very clever for this design. But that design element and construction element leads me to the next word that I chose for this hat, which was trusting. Now, this is really where knitting experience comes into play. There are several moments where your work kind of looks strange. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. I'm looking at you, reverse stockinette strip of fabric right here. The pattern has you reverse the direction of your knitting. So once you have folded the brim and tacked the 2 edges of stitches together, you have to then reverse your work and begin working in the other direction. You're looking at a seam that's eventually going to disappear because of this reversing direction of your work, so that when you fold your brim over, you no longer see where you connected those stitches. And you can see kind of what's going on right here. You can see there's an interesting thing going on here on the inside of the hat. I feel like when this starts to happen, when this starts to happen here. You start to fold things over before you really fully understand why. There's definitely moments where you find yourself saying, okay, especially if you've never done this before, you're thinking, okay, I'm gonna do this. I'm trusting you, Hailey. I'm trusting you to lead me down the right path because this isn't making full sense to me. When I started to see this happening, it didn't really make a lot of sense to me. But you trust. You have to trust because number one, she's an experienced designer. She has lots of patterns out there. We trust, okay? Even if we don't see something concrete to guide us visually speaking. Some patterns ask you to trust individual techniques and then other patterns ask you to trust the construction, and this is very much one of the latter. It isn't until everything suddenly comes together that the geometry makes sense, and it eventually does. Perfect sense. It's just really difficult to visualize it as you're getting there. But it does. It eventually does, which leads me to the third word that I chose for this hat, which is rewarding. Because there comes a moment when everything just clicks. The folds make sense. The construction makes sense. And then suddenly, before you know it, you're holding a hat. There's something deeply rewarding about watching an unusual construction gradually reveal itself to you. The pattern asks you to trust it for a while, and then, almost all at once, it lets you in on what it was doing the whole time. Now, I want to talk about my nitpicks because I do have them, but again, this is just to play, it's not even like devil's advocate, but I do think that you do have to express, especially when you're giving rave reviews for something, there's got to be something in there, right, that you can provide a little bit of criticism for. If I had to provide nitpicks for the North Shore beanie, these are the ones that I'd come up with, and these are the ones that I have come up with. The biggest thing I'd change would simply be adding a few more visual checkpoints along the way. Not necessarily photographs. I know that that can be difficult. It takes up a lot of space in the pattern, but simply something that lets you know if this is what you're seeing, you're on the right track. Because the construction of this hat is unlike the construction of most hats of this particular style. So something that just lets you know and affirms that you are doing this correctly is helpful. It's helpful especially if you have a knitter coming to this hat who may be a relatively experienced knitter, just not experienced with this construction style. So some visual checkpoints, even if it means just assuring the knitter that what they're seeing is correct. I think that would be helpful. Okay, now this ties to my second observation a little bit. In the pattern, it asks you to do a German short row, or I guess I should say work a German short row. Now, technically, that's true. In the pattern, you are turning the work, creating a double stitch, and then working around in the opposite direction. However, when a pattern suggests that you execute a German short row, you're thinking that there's some kind of shaping going on, that you are going to be completing an incomplete row or a short row where you're going to turn and come back, creating wedges of fabric. In my opinion, a German short row is just that. It is short. Any short row. However, what's happening here is simply you are turning your work, working a double stitch, and then you begin working the hat in the opposite direction. You are simply turning the direction of your work. Referring to that as a German short row, again, this is a nitpick, in my opinion, can be a little bit misleading if you're familiar with that having something to do with actual shaping, because it does not in any way shape the hat. It simply changes the direction that you're knitting. And I felt like the inclusion of German short row, both in the techniques laid out at the beginning of the pattern and then also being referred to that in the pattern itself, was just a little misleading. It's a tiny wording choice, but I do think that making that a little bit, maybe just excluding the term short row, I think would be helpful. Because folks are going to relate that to something else. Again, a nitpick, and you may not agree, and that's fine. Your mileage may vary. It is definitely not anything detracting from the pattern. I'm just providing little things that I did notice or that I did flag as I was reading through the pattern and working through the pattern now twice. One of the things I enjoy most about knitting is when a pattern causes me to change the way that I think. Sometimes it's because it introduces a new to me technique. Sometimes because it shows me a different way to build something that I am otherwise so familiar with. The double brimmed hat, just the knit hat in general. This pattern did that second thing, and I appreciate it so much for that. I finished one, immediately cast on another, and I already know it probably won't be my last. And for me, that's about the strongest recommendation I can give. Now, before we wrap up, I want to share with you where I picked up the yarn, not for this one, but for my second North Shore beanie. This is the Camarosa Snefnug. And I want to share with you where I got this because it was in Seward, Alaska. And my goodness, you guys, we turned the corner as we were walking. We turned the corner and we saw the outside of this place. And the first word, honestly, the first word on the sign that caught my attention was books, because on the upper wall of the place is a mural of books, like books on a shelf. And as many of you know, I'm an avid reader. My husband and I host a podcast here on YouTube about books. I'm wearing the shirt today. So I was excited to see a bookstore because it was obviously something we were both wanting to do. In fact, I'm looking over here because my husband is editing one of our videos right in my office right over here. But we were looking for bookstores. And so we saw this and thought it was great. But then when I saw the word yarn on the sign as well, I'm like, what? Books and yarn? Yeah, so I was excited, to say the least. This place is called Dreamland Books and Yarn. And again, it's in Seward, Alaska. It's a beautifully curated little bookshop and yarn shop, and I think that's exactly why it stood out to me. It isn't huge. It isn't trying to carry everything. Instead, it has this really thoughtful selection of books and yarn, and every shelf feels intentionally chosen. It's the kind of shop where you find yourself slowing down a little and appreciating what's there. I honestly could have been there all afternoon and be completely content in doing that. It was one of my favorite stops on the trip, and if you ever find yourself in Seward, it's absolutely worth visiting. The owner of the shop, I met her. Her name was Michelle Kowalski. She was a lovely person. I have a little bookmark that came from there, and it was great. This is what the sign on the outside looks like right here. I can't even tell you. I absolutely loved it. I got something else from there as well, and I'm going to be sharing that over on the after show for this episode. It is yarn related, and it's adorable, and I can't wait to work on that as well. So that is going to be in the after show. I have a few other things that I want to share with you as it relates to things that I picked up along my trip in Alaska. I also have, and I don't know if you can see it. Oh, it's over here. I have a big bundle of yarn back here on my couch. That is going to be the beginnings of a new sweater saga that I think you're going to want to be a part of. I'm going to be doing this with my sister-in-law, Jessica, whom you may remember. It's going to be interesting. I have theories. I have a plan. It involves duping a sweater that we saw on the Free People website, because why not? That is going to be done over on Patreon. I'll share any kind of progress, obviously, here on the channel as well, but all of the ins and outs and how we're going to do that and that whole saga and process is going to be over on the Patreon, so you're going to want to check over there, see if it's for you. It's a great way to help support the channel here, and we would so love to have you join up that community. It's a great group of people over there. Okay, if you've knit the North Shore beanie, I would love to hear about your experience. You can drop all of that down in the comment section below. And since Ravelry asked the question, I'm going to go ahead and ask this question of you as well. If you had to describe this pattern in 3 words, what would it be? And you can actually base that off of just what I've shared with you here, or if you have the experience of knitting the hat yourself. It's a really fun, I don't know, it's funny how you can kind of chalk something up to 3 words and really get the message across. I think it's great. So good on you, Ravelry, for incorporating that. I think it's a great way to get people thinking about what they did as opposed to just, I liked it. All right, guys, thank you for hanging out with me. Thank you for listening to me ramble about this hat pattern. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And until I see you guys again, happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye.